Good afternoon. We'll be starting the Regulating Food Trucks in the Age of Meal Delivery webinar in just a minute. We have a few people jumping on and we'll get started here shortly. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brooke Benscooter and I'm with the Association of Food and Drug Officials. And we're glad to have you joining us this afternoon on this great Monday for the AFDO Professional Development Series. We're here today with Michael and Charlie Kalish. They will be discussing regulating food trucks in the age of meal delivery. I'm biased. I love spending time listening to Charlie and Michael talk about topics, and you're going to get to hear what they have to say about this topic, but also have an opportunity to ask some questions. We'll be taking questions in the box along the way, but we'll also have an opportunity to answer questions at the end of the webinar. So don't hesitate if you want to put your question in as discussion goes on. That would be great. So for those of you that are not familiar, Michael and Charlie Kalish are the co-founders and co-owners of Food Safety Guides, a cloud-based food safety consulting and training company. Michael and Charlie are also the champions of the Food Network's Great Food Truck Race, Series 7, and they were Chopped finalists. So they have experience really on both sides of the fence here. So as I mentioned, we will be opening phone lines when we give you the okay. Feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you if you have a question or put your question in the box. So with that, I'm excited to, oh, one other thing before I forget. For those of you that want to share the recording of this afterwards, the recording will be available in a day or so 24 to 48 hours. So if you want to share it with other people, there'll be a link on the AFDO website in the Professional Development Series page, and you'll also probably see it on social media. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Michael Kalish to get started on our topic today. Michael?
Thank you, Brooke. It's great to be here. Thanks everybody for joining the webinar. And we look forward to sharing with you our experience and insights into food trucks in the age of meal delivery. Charlie's also on the line and he's going to be kicking off the presentation with the first initial slides. So Charlie.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Charlie Kalish. Michael and I do sound very close. It's very hard to tell the difference between us, so I'll always try to say, hey, this is Charlie if we change. Don't want to confuse anyone. So here we're going to be talking about the challenges of regulating food trucks in the age of meal delivery and how technology is changing meal delivery for food trucks. Here's our agenda. We're going to start out first by discussing in brief what this new age is like. Michael's going to take you through some examples of new entities that are involved in these complex relationships that can exist between food trucks and the public. And then from there, we're going to go into how we can improve as a community of regulators and industry professionals the way that we regulate these food trucks. So first off, I want to start about from what did food trucks used to be versus what they are now and where they're going. And Michael, I'll tell you when to change the slide, okay? We normally use our telepathy for that, but we'll hold off for this one. So where they used to be, it was quite simple. You know, somebody was very entrepreneurial. They saved up money, they got a truck, and they went around your local neighborhood and sold delicious food for people to eat. This has changed quite a bit with our new mobile culture, using apps where people were able to use, for example, websites to locate trucks, use apps to order food from food trucks so that they could be delivered directly to them, or they can go to the truck and pick it up. That's more where we are now. And where we're going is really sky's the limit with technology. They're everywhere from delivery by drones to using Uber Eats delivery drivers on mopeds to transport food from ghost kitchens to people's homes or to businesses. You can see there on the graphic on the far right, we have a conveyor belt with prepackaged food. So we're seeing a movement towards activities that we usually think of in terms of manufacturers and processors that is being mixed in with retail operations, which is like food trucks. So quite a big change from what food trucks used to be to where they're going. Michael, you can change the slide, please. So among the many changes that we're seeing is, as I mentioned, that we're seeing operations that were traditionally food service retail start moving along the spectrum that you can see on the bottom of the slide towards the kinds of activities we see with the manufacturer processor. We're also seeing a movement in geographical distribution. We can have one company that operates a fleet of food trucks that has national ambitions or even global ambitions. So they can be operating their food trucks in different counties, different states, all around the nation. And as they're developing a national strategy, what's happening on the regulator side? We still have a relatively fragmented system for regulating food businesses. And so a department in one county or one state might not be benefiting from what another county or another state has learned about that particular company in the way that they're operating, and vice versa. So go ahead and change the slide, please. Here are a number of other spectrums that sort of compare where we've been and where we're going. So the brown boxes are sort of in the past or even today in some areas, and then the red box is sort of where we're going, or in some cases, in some counties, in some states, they're already there. So for the top one is volume of production. Traditionally, it was a low volume of production. Sorry, hold on one second.
That's where I take over.
I made the big mistake of leaving my window open with the 2-year-old outside. So we started with a relatively low volume production, and so the risk was significantly lower. And over time, we're seeing, if we look at the Blue Aprons of the world, for example, for meal delivery, we're seeing, millions of kits or meals being produced a day, and it can be distribution. They can have, distribution in multiple states, not nationally. So we're seeing that go to high. The complexity of the supply chain has increased a lot, where we have a number of other players involved. Before it was just one truck handing it over. Now we have a whole number of entities that Michael's going to guide you through. And then, of course, there's the geographical distribution, which we saw on the map before. So with that, as you can imagine and probably well know, a lot of you, there are a lot of challenges associated with this movement to the right. And so I'm going to let Michael sort of talk about the new entities and the new relationships that we're seeing and the challenges that they pose. So Michael, go ahead, I'll mute.
Thank you, Charlie. And I've sort of broken up the different sections of this presentation with just a general question. In this case, we're going to take a look at the different kind of entities that are involved in the food truck business model that we're seeing. And Charlie mentioned the sort of we call it a wheel and spoke model, where we essentially have a single commissary kitchen, and that would then provide services to many different food trucks. Now, that's not something that's really new. That's been around for a while. But what we're looking at is that model scaling upward and also being perhaps dominated by one or two companies rather than a large number of small individual businesses. So this is a little graphic we pulled together just to illustrate the different entities involved. You'll probably be familiar with most all of these, and I'm just going to walk you through them. We're also going to go over the different relationships that exist between these entities and where regulators have an opportunity to make an intervention, whether it be proactive or reactive. So the first entity I'd like to focus on is the commissary. It's something that we're pretty familiar with across the country. It has different names. Base of operations is one I've seen on the East Coast. Central preparation facility is a kind of registration we find in Texas. And then retail food establishment is a term that's commonly used by USDA or FDA. So when we look at commissaries, we're really looking at the handling of food. Normally associated with commissaries are many more other activities. I'm going to talk about those in a different entity. But for those businesses that are increasingly relying on restaurants to provide them with the food service operations they need, they may go with another entity called, I'm going to call it a service station, but this is where you might have access to power. So if you're using the truck to store food overnight, for example, you might be relying on shore power, but you may have a variety of different power sources. As for cleaning and sanitizing, generally that's what's happening at the commissary when a service station is sort of baked into its construction. But here at the service station, you can expect that people are going to be cleaning things out of place. If there's like large utensils that or equipment that would need to be taken off the truck. I know for some counties, taking things off the truck is forbidden. Other counties, it's a possibility, but that would be an example of a clean out of place, whether it be in a 3-compartment sink on the truck or in the 3-compartment sink, or maybe a larger sort of wash area available at the service station. And then this is also where we're sort of hosing down the interior of the truck, and we're flushing it out, normally the emergency door. And so that would be a sort of cleaning of the interior, but cleaning of the exterior can happen there too. It could also happen at a car wash. This is where folks are evacuating their wastewater and then refilling their potable water. They're also, as I mentioned before, storing their vehicle overnight. This is also a place where they could potentially get preventive maintenance if the service station is in a place where it's appropriately zoned. And lastly, similar to the commissary mentioned earlier, there may be overnight food storage on board, assuming that there's shore power or some way of powering the vehicle. The site is where the sales are happening. In Austin, Texas is really the only one place, if maybe other people on the line are aware of other places that might have food truck parks. But there are sites on private property in Austin where they provide shore power to the truck, in which case it could be run either by a generator or, like I said, by shore power. Parking, it really varies from city to city. This is actually one of the driving complications for food truck models for food truck businesses that have sort of this national ambition Charlie was mentioning about. Zoning, to be able to operate in cities across the country, you do need a special understanding of zoning and parking restrictions, different operating restrictions for that city. And then some cities outright say there's just no access to public right of way. It has to be on private property. While in other cities, public right of way may be available depending on the zone. LA is actually quite flexible on that. They limit it to following parking restrictions. It is a commercial vehicle, so there are some restrictive parking criteria. But yeah, in Texas, private. In Austin, private would be the only way to go. This is also where we see folks prepping food and executing. So thawing is something that's kind of contentious. Thawing is not always permitted on the vehicle, and understandably, but understanding what kind of prep is available to a business is really important as they look to fulfill their national ambition. Like I said, it's extremely fragmented out there on what you can and cannot do. So that's something I'll be touching on a little bit later. Potable water, this is hard to come by, and this is mainly why we see a need for trucks to return to their commissary or service station to refill potable water. That is going to be increasingly important in the era of COVID, because hand washing is something that we'd like to see people do more often. But we're not seeing food trucks necessarily increase their potable water capacity. In a lot of states, or excuse me, a lot of counties across many states, the potable water capacity doesn't always have a minimum. In many cases, it's 30 gallons, but it's normally tied to the what kind of operations you're involved in. If you're making smoothies, for example, you're going to be likely rinsing out your equipment very frequently, in which case your need for water will be much higher. But these counties that have decided that there is a minimum potable water requirement don't always account for that. As for wastewater, there are just these three things that we look out for, at least on the industry side: avoiding leaks and overflow, controlling backflow, eliminating potential cross connections, and making sure there are no odors. In other words, just making sure that those tanks are clean. I see we have a question from Lauren Coles. For trucks that utilize car washes, often city water sewer will not want this to happen due to the amount of grease that could go into the drains. Have you seen any proposed restrictions for use of car washes only for the outside of the truck when they are approved? I have seen uses for car washes of the exterior only. No, I have not seen any car wash that's accepted a vehicle that would dump their wastewater. I believe that would, I have never seen that before. I don't know if that's really available, but I would caution against it. I don't believe the car washes, sewers are designed for that, especially the accommodation of grease. But I could be wrong. I'm not sure. But that's outside of my knowledge set. The last entity that I want to touch on was, I'm calling it offsite, but this was really a catch-all to express sort of the places where folks might be using their phones to order food, or simply have the food truck parked outside and fulfill orders curbside. So that could be residences, it could be offices. But the reason I call that hotels, restaurants, and similar institutions, as many of you might be aware of, is because of the USDA exemption for retail stores. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. Offsite is also where we see the most deployment of technology. So that comes into play with order placement. As Charlie mentioned, people are using meal delivery service platforms to make their deliveries, to make their orders for either pickup or delivery. But also increasingly restaurants are looking for a direct way of receiving orders. For a long time, we've seen folks taking orders by phone, increasingly obviously online. But those are really sort of two technologies that we see gaining a lot of traction across the food industry, especially with dining facilities closed at the moment. Now, where I'm really excited about technology going in the food truck arena is order management. If you have 3 or 4 trucks stationed around a city, for example, an order might come in online from a cell phone that provides geolocation data to suggest that it's closer to one vehicle than another, or closer to a vehicle than the brick and mortar restaurant, in which case those orders can be triaged at the point of ordering, so that trucks are not overwhelmed with orders, but also they can fulfill orders by minimizing the distance to the consumer. That would increase delivery time, it would shorten delivery time. And when I'm looking at this from a food safety perspective, the number one thing I'm thinking about is time. Time as a public health control. What can I do to reduce the amount of time between someone's handling of food and someone consuming it? Can it be below 20 minutes? I've heard folks at Uber Eats mention that their deliveries can show data trends of delivery being under 20 minutes. That's amazing. So for me, the big question mark with meal delivery, especially grocery delivery, has always been, how long is that package sitting out there? There's a real opportunity there with the technology, not just to reduce the time between prep and consumption, but tracking it, trending it, and communicating it to regulators. Okay, and lastly is, I did want to give a shout out to confirming receipt of food, because that is going to be where you sort of say, okay, the consumer has received the food, presumably putting it into refrigeration or consuming it right away. But that's the kind of data that we're interested in on the industry side from a consulting perspective, but also I imagine would be valuable to folks on the regulator side. Lastly is handoff, and it's probably the most important for COVID. How do people receive the food? It's increasingly complicated. So we call this omnichannel sales, by the way. In industry, if you're looking to diversify how you hand off food or make sales, we call it omnichannel. So the first one would be someone walks up and says, hey, I'd like a taco. So that would be consumer ordering and pickup. But you might also have somebody working for your company delivering it, like say, local pizza joint has a pizza delivery person that might deliver their pizza. And then increasingly, we're seeing meal delivery platform, contract delivery persons. Right? So the way that food's getting to the consumer, wherever they might be off-site or on-site, is becoming increasingly complicated. So these things need to be taken into consideration as we look for opportunities to reduce the time it takes to get to consumer. If I have somebody delivering 3 or 4 meals and they don't get the 4th meal to the consumer, say within an hour, that could be problematic. Depending on what they ordered and what the risk was associated with it, how long the prep time was. These are things that we'd like to factor into our food safety assessment. Okay, so I'm going to move on.
Mike, can I add one thing to that? And this,
Please.
Because of the focus of the presentations largely on food trucks, we're not really talking so much about meal delivery that involves delivery by a common carrier, like many of the meal delivery companies, the Blue Aprons of the world. They often deliver via a common carrier, like could be FedEx or something like that, where they go through unrefrigerated warehouses and they really depend a lot on the insulated packaging that they have, and that people, when they receive it, that they open it up soon. All kinds of challenges to that, like in summer when it's really hot out, say in Arizona, and there's raw chicken sitting in a box on their doorstep. This has actually been a topic that's been explored by like Don Schaffner and others in really great ways, but we're just going to focus more on this supply chain, which relates to food trucks. But there are a lot of great questions there. I'm sure people thought about it. Go ahead.
Thank you, Charlie. So we did get a question from Barry Bell. What do you suggest require for sanitary facilities available for your truck staff to use? We require facilities in retail manufacturing settings. You suggest for sanitary facility. I don't understand your question. If you could resubmit, I'm happy to answer that question. I'm going to keep going. Okay, so we're going to focus a little bit on the relationships. And I'm just going to call out some considerations to make. So this is the most simplistic, restroom availability. Thank you, Barry. For example, a workaround for restroom availability that I've seen commonly in industry is making available a list of locations of McDonald's and Starbucks who have, I believe McDonald's. I know Starbucks has vocally said that their restrooms are available to the general public. And so that's been, and due to their popularity and being just about everywhere, that's been an effective way for food trucks to get around that restroom requirement. Not really get around, but really satisfied. So I hope that gives you a good example. Okay, so I'm going to look at this relationship between commissary and offsite, because this is obviously the most simplistic one. This is when we think of delivery, like if I were to order Domino's, I would think it came from a Domino's store. In this case, the commissary itself could be fulfilling orders, not by the food truck, but by a delivery person fulfilling the order directly from the commissary. So that may happen. That's important because I'm going to talk about this later as I address the USDA retail exemption. Same with FDA, if you sell more direct to consumer than you do through any other channel, then you would be considered a retail food establishment under FDA. So I'm going to come back to that. For now, I'm going to focus on sales coming through the site. That also could be delivered subsequently from the site by a meal delivery service provider. And the relationship between the site and service station would be simply that, where essentially we wouldn't see the truck necessarily handling food in these relationships here, but it's possible that it might have stored the food overnight. So considerations. So for the first one is just time, temperature. When was the food executed? When did it depart? When did it arrive? and what are the standards that we'd like to have for what temperature and time ought to look like. Obviously, that's going to be different in Florida in the summertime than it might in Connecticut in the wintertime. But these are, what we're generally following is FDA food code recommendations. Packaging integrity is something to look for as well when performing inspections for obvious reasons. There's been a study that came out recently on folks opening packages that were delivered to consumers. So really, time, temperature, and packaging integrity are certainly where we have the greatest insight into how food safe delivery might be. But then there's also the delivery worker health. I've been reading a lot online through CDC, FDA, OSHA, elsewhere, the fact that COVID can survive on certain substrates like stainless steel, plastic, cardboard for a limited amount of time. But if the delivery worker is ill and delivering a box and it's consumed within the next 20 minutes, that likely would not provide enough time for that virus to be eliminated. So that would be something that would also fall into the interest of an inspector. And lastly is customer contact. How do we reduce it? What are the terms for delivery and pickup? I know that a lot of people are using plexiglass in grocery stores. I remember reading in New York the sort of delivery and ditch model. So, but there are some best practices I'll be sharing with you later on. All right, for site, the considerations here again are time and temperature. We're looking at packing integrity again as they load the food onto the vehicle. And then lastly, the health between the food handlers and everyone else involved. These considerations will be the same as the first, so I'm not going to spend too much time on those. And then service station here is, when we're as consultants and looking to inspect the facility, if I can use that term, we want to know what is the status of your relationship. When was the last time you were there? How often do you go there? Some counties do require, actually, let me rephrase that. Many counties require that you document your daily return to the service station, but not all. Actually, and I'm going to use Austin again because it's such an anomaly, but you do not necessarily need to return. You do need the services, but you don't necessarily need to return to your commissary on a daily basis. We do see that in some counties in California as well. And then there's station availability. With the increase in demand for commissaries and the interest of the commissary to make more money, they could extend their services to more food trucks than they can handle all at once. Maybe they presume that they can accommodate all the food trucks because they don't come every day. Some food trucks will have contracts with perhaps 2 different service stations or commissaries, so that depending on what side of the city or county they're servicing, they can go to either one. But station availability is an important one because that obviously would, if it's unavailable, it would limit your access to potable water and an opportunity to clean, sanitize your facilities. And then there's water quality. And this is something that we kind of take for granted, but most folks will be using municipal water supplies. And we assume that will be safe. But if you were to look at sort of the riskiest thing, like if one thing fell through on a food truck, what would be the most devastating? And poor water quality would certainly be it. So the FDA Food Code does address ways in which they can reduce the likelihood of contaminating water through good plumbing practices. So I'll touch on that a little bit later, but that's something reassuring and something you can refer to. As for the relationship between the commissary and the service station, if a restaurant is being used as a commissary, these entities are distinct, it's important to have these four considerations, which really relate to a pre-op inspection of hygiene, sanitation, supply stocks, like soap, water, hand wash, paper towels, food storage temps, and water quality. Increasingly we see technology become more and more affordable that allows for continuous electronic temperature monitoring. And so that is something we certainly have been pushing as consultants, but it does provide someone with an understanding of really, was their food stored safely if stored offsite at a service station. These requirements, that's required for, I know in California, it's required for businesses that are engaged in like sous vide and cook chill at a brick and mortar restaurant because the risk is high. And consequently, it does give you quite a bit more confidence in the safety of the food. so that's the general relationships between different entities involved in food trucks. I'm going to now transition a little bit over to plan
Michael,
check.
could I ask you a
Yeah.
favor? It just occurred to me while just listening to you, even though we've gone over this
Uh-huh.
before, but could you elaborate a little bit more on the role here of ghost kitchens? Because I think that's still somewhat of a new concept for some people.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So ghost kitchens, also known as dark kitchens and cloud kitchens, are essentially restaurants without a dining room. So they can accommodate pickup, but they generally don't have a dining room. They generally don't hand off food to consumers. They're operating basically under a label name. So if you wanted to order, I don't know if this happens with Domino's or not, but I'll just use them as an example. If you want to order Domino's and you get your pizza, you would assume that came from a Domino's store. But in fact, it might come from this kitchen that's also supplying food trucks and manufacturing pizza on a scale where they can fulfill demand for through online orders. So dark kitchens, cloud kitchens, ghost kitchens, all the same name for essentially this restaurant that is fulfilling online orders. So that makes things a little complicated for the consumer, because consumer has certain expectations, and if they have a problem, how do they find where this facility is? How do they report it? Especially if the source of the food is being triaged through technology from one restaurant to a ghost kitchen to a different ghost kitchen. Traceability may be challenging if you're looking at regulating industry on a business by business basis, or excuse me, a facility by facility basis rather than a business by business basis. Charlie mentioned earlier that businesses could be extended over multiple counties and multiple states. So while a consultant might be hired by a company to address globally the problems associated with a business owning many ghost kitchens, you may be, as regulators, simply reaching out to individual facilities and just sort of trying to guess what an elephant is by being blind and touching one part of it. So, yeah, Charlie, any other thoughts there?
I think just to elaborate on the theme of this section about the complications that come out of this is, as technology is allowing these businesses to scale up in terms of their geographical distribution, how many people they're serving, in terms of the volume of food that they're making, in terms of their sales. A lot of the technology as far as food production is concerned is they're using equipment from, say, food service as opposed to manufacturing, and not all these entities have really made that jump to using equipment that's actually hygienically designed for making that volume of food. And so that just brings in a whole other challenges for food safety on the back end of this whole system.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. We're seeing sort of like hygiene principles for cooks being applied to the larger scale production of prepared food. And I do want to answer Sarah's question. How is the service station different from a commissary? It isn't always necessarily distinct. I put them next to each other because it's true. There are many commissaries out there that have all the amenities that a service station might have. So in that case, they wouldn't be two distinct entities. But in some cases, like there may be mobile waste haulers, in which case the commissary is not necessarily the place where a business may be evacuating their wastewater. I don't know if that's legal or an option necessarily in your county, but it is in others. And then normally, especially in California, we see commissaries being standalone businesses, but increasingly we're seeing an industry that they're restaurants, because businesses that want to specialize in food trucks might say, well, just use your restaurant as for food prep and food storage, and then you can park your truck at some kind of service station, or you may be receiving services from a number of different service providers. I haven't even talked about propane refilling, but propane refilling might be a service that could also be performed perhaps at another location. All right, so on to plan check. What can be done to harmonize food truck construction and design requirements? This has definitely been an issue for industry as it looks to fulfill its multi-county or national ambitions. So how can regulators aid food truck owners? Well, you really have to choose where you can add value, because there are so many different disciplines that are included in building and deploying a food truck. So here I've just listed 11, but you'll notice that all of these more or less apply also to a restaurant, a brick and mortar restaurant. So I don't pretend that that you don't have some sort of experience with, say, ANSL systems, fire suppression systems, or supply chain issues. But food trucks certainly are a microcosm of the brick and mortar restaurant. It has everything all wrapped up in one, and if anything should fail, it generally affects the entire operation. Well, in a restaurant, there may be something that's complicated but can be worked around. So it is and I should also mention that food truck businesses, especially the smaller ones, they have a limited understanding of perhaps some of these disciplines, right? So maybe somebody who knows a lot about electrical, mechanical, and plumbing might not be as keen on understanding supply chain food safety. So fortunately, the FDA Food Code provided us over the last 20 years or so an FDA Food Code mobile food establishment matrix. And I remember first seeing this, being really excited, thinking that all my questions about what a food truck ought to do or ought to be designed as would be answered. Despite the fact that different states have adopted different versions of the FDA Food Code, the mobile food establishment matrix has stayed relatively the same. So that was also reassuring. But as you can see here, there are really only two sections that apply. Here we have mobile water tank and mobile food establishment water tank, section 5.3, which is helpful, but it also explains things very generally. 5.4 addresses sewage, and again, this sort of addresses like cross connection and backflow prevention. We have the capacity and drainage here that's cited in most every county's requirements. But again, it's also extremely general and not always so helpful. I do appreciate the FDA Food Code Working Group put together this Annex 3. By the way, I'm using the 2017 version. But it really isn't enough. The other sections do not customize their requirements specifically in mobile food establishments, which leaves out certain things like fire, sinks, storage, and it also excludes a risk-based approach to requiring food trucks to have this or that. San Francisco, for example, like many other counties, they sort of have a tiered system where, if you're preparing foods from raw versus simply distributing food in boxes, those requirements will vary as to what it is that you need. I mentioned fire, and I know a lot of people might say, well, hey, we're not responsible for electrical codes or mechanical codes or anything related to fire. But you might not also be related to plumbing. I mean, there are plumbing codes out there. But because the impact on food safety is so significant, the working group has jumped on water and sewage, and I think they did a great job at it. There just needs to be a lot more attention to requirements elsewhere, and the more that we come to terms or harmonize our requirements around hygienic design for food trucks, the less back and forth there will be at plan check. It'll be a much more efficient process, and hopefully with restaurants not having a brick and mortar store necessarily available to them in the future, could have some options. Charlie and I did write an article for Food Safety Magazine that was published just recently on this subject. So if you want to read more about it, you can go there. We'll provide you the link. And the next section here is about food safety messaging. So we've talked a lot about sort of business models, the relationships between entities and the entities involved with food trucks. But how can regulators speak to operators in a way that allows or encourages operators to retain food safety concepts? So I can talk a little bit about flow, zones, and terms. First is flow. So if you're doing an inspection, at least I'm speaking from a consultant's point of view. If I'm going into a facility and I only get 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour of time there, let's say once a quarter or once a year, I'm not going to have enough context to understand where things ought to be. I won't be able to quickly identify nonconformance issues or risks to food safety. So one of the most important things you can do in understanding what might be okay and not okay is understanding the flow. And by the way, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, and you probably all know this. I'm just pretending like I'm speaking to someone that's new to the business. So is it unidirectional? In this case, we tend to see taco trucks, pizza trucks, poke trucks. They tend to have a single flow from left to right, where it simply goes out the window at the end of the flow. This is, you can imagine we have raw on the left and cooked and prepared and assembled, fully assembled on the right. So you got the raw pizza dough, you put down the sauce, goes into an oven, comes out of the oven, and you finish it with toppings, slice it, put it in a box, and send it out. There are some cases where convergent flows are more popular. For example, you could say burger. So maybe you have raw meat on the left, which goes onto a grill, and then from the grill, it goes onto a bun on the right-hand side. You might say, oh, well, then that would be unidirectional. But do you really want to put a wet, greasy, not wet, but a greasy burger patty first on a bun if you're thinking it's not going to get to the consumer for maybe 20, 30 minutes? You probably want to put it on last. So what you could see is on the right-hand side, you could see people essentially plating buns and then loading them up with like produce and other dry items until it gets to finally putting down the patty, in which case it'll have some protection from wetting the bun, and you get a happier customer at the end. So that would be a convergent flow. Here we have a divergent flow. This could happen where you have cooked items going one way and cold items going another, and by means of a circle, they sort of meet at the pass-through window. Not as common, but occasionally we see it. And then we have random, which could apply especially with like one-person shows, where they just kind of put things wherever they feel like they can access them more quickly or more often based on their demand, but not necessarily a flow there. Anyhow, having these different types of flow being recognized initially allows you to sort of see, well, I get the feeling like that might be used as a prep surface and that might be inappropriate because it really doesn't belong in the flow of raw materials moving towards cooked. So like I said, provides context for placement utensils, appropriate areas for prep, personal behavior, and lastly, cleanliness of surfaces. So next is zones. On a food truck, I like to break them up into 4 primary zones: raw, ready to eat, package, and sanitation. If you're familiar with manufacturing facilities and zoning, it's normally it's more like, it can be a little more complicated. They might have a GMP zone, for example, high risk area, and so on. But I like this general area. I'm going to provide you just a glimpse into my theoretical Taco Tuesday truck. And here you can see we have a raw side on the left-hand side, and it's a unidirectional flow. So we're making tacos. So it starts with the raw prep in the grill, which then gets dropped into a hot holding device, which is then used to fulfill tortillas, which are then topped and packaged and then staged for moving through the pass-through. And then I have, in the yellow area, I have packaged goods. So this is where, obviously I probably have the smallest need for hand washing in this area, unless of course I'm having contact with the customer. But here I have ready to eat foods in the blue. So it goes from raw, ready to eat. I'll likely have to have access to this hand wash sink the most in those areas. And then I have packaging on the right side. So I'm kind of folding into my layout areas where I generally want to see specific practices used by personnel that are designated work with either raw, ready to eat, or packaged goods. So I do like using these little triangles to sort of illustrate that as it moves from left to right, it becomes more customized, becomes more assembled, it becomes more ready to eat. And from right to left, I see an increase in hand washing, increase in temperature control, and increase in sanitation. So this is a very methodical way of looking at designing a food truck. If a food truck's already designed and you have no more opportunity to share input, okay, but at plan check, generally you have some opportunity to say, well, what's your flow? And how are you looking at this from a zoning perspective? So as far as terms are concerned, I'm going to go through this pretty quick, by the way. I like to break it up into clean, cleanable, sanitary, and functional. I added healthy too. These generally summarize the federal GMPs, but I see that they work very well also for communicating food safety concepts at the retail level. So clean can mean many different things to people in a facility. You could have a clean floor, but you could have a clean table. They don't mean the same thing. So cleanly generally means free of filth, free of potential contaminants. Organized means things are in their designated location. And lastly is safe, and that means things are protected from other things possibly falling into it, so possible contamination and infestation. So when someone says, hey, I don't think that's clean, what do you mean? Do you mean it's not cleanly? Do you mean it's not organized? Do you mean it's not safe? The nice thing about this too is that you can define what clean means for a specific part of a facility, whether it be a food truck or otherwise. Cleanable is pretty straightforward. Can it be cleaned? There's some things that just can't be effectively cleaned. I've seen equipment where, the person says, well, if I clean that, it'll start to rust. Okay, well then it's not really cleanable. So that's something that we have to have a game plan for substituting for. Next is sanitary. This is sort of a catch-all in a way. I like to think of it as appropriate, adequate, and good repair. So people aren't misusing something that perhaps is intended for the automobile industry. It's not being used for anything involved in the food truck where it might have contact with food. Adequate, good example of that might be water pressure. Make sure that there's sufficient pressure to wash your hands. I know probably most of you have tried to wash your hands in a United flight, right? It's pretty weak. Or if you're at an outdoor concert and using the foot pump. We're looking for normally 1 gallon per minute is generally the standard we see across the country. And then good repair. So just to give you an example, something that's clean and cleanable but not sanitary, a knife. If you have a knife and it's clean, let's say you test it, shows that it's clean, it's cleanable because you can wash a knife, you can move it through a 3-compartment sink. But if it's chipped, it's just not in good repair, and we don't know what happens to that chip. So good repair is a good one for remembering in sanitary. Next is functional, means that it works as intended. If it's a pH meter, if it's a thermometer, whatever technology you have on board, it's functioning. And lastly is it's maintained, handled with care, and service when needed. And that can apply to the food truck as a whole. So generally I like to say, well, is it clean, is it cleanable, is it sanitary, and is it functional? Most people can remember those 4 terms, but most people can't really grasp onto all the different requirements that might fold their way into these categories. And then lastly, it's healthy. And this is actually a new one for me because I just assumed that it was important. But with COVID, I realized the importance of addressing what does healthy mean. Here I put symptom-free and protected, but there may be a greater opportunity to expand this category. So yeah, I like putting this on a note card and sharing it with clients so that on the floor, people understand what it is that they're looking out for. And if they need to report a problem to a food safety manager, they can say something's not clean. The manager can come in and see whether it's not cleanly, organized, or safe. And that's how that might work. So I know Charlie has told me you guys are probably blue in the face with COVID news. So I'm going to make this really quick. But how can food truck design technology practices best address COVID-19? There are a lot of resources made available online. So I'm going to flip through this fairly quickly. FDA has made really great frequently asked questions section that address a lot of common questions related to food service and retail. But they also have a webpage entirely designated for COVID-19. So recommend that you check that out. This is their best practices diagram for retail food stores and food pickup and delivery. So pretty consistent with things we've been talking about. Really, that social distancing is going to be really important. And I think that food trucks have the opportunity to establish that social distance. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. If you look at the OSHA landing page for COVID control and prevention, they categorize our industry as being medium. And so in that case, they recommend that we also consider the interim guidance. You can see that applies to low risk there, the lower risk categories. But they do come up with some useful ideas that we see sort of reiterated in the FDA guidance. So just administrative controls, safe work practices, and personal protective equipment. They leave it up to us to determine whether or not the risk is high enough to use PPE. I'm a huge proponent of it. And if you turn to the CDC's guidance, you'll see there on their guidance for grocery and retail stores that they do encourage use of face masks. Increased hand washing. And that's going to be problematic because, like I said, we have a limited amount of potable water on a food truck. It just might mean that they return to the service station or commissary more often. I see we have a mounting number of questions here, so I'm going to get to those as soon as I finish this section. So generally here, what we're seeing from these guidances is increasing and cleaning and sanitizing, and that can be through increased potable water supply to accommodate that higher frequency of hand washing. Having a pre-op sanitizing, obviously most people would clean the truck at the end of the day and then start the food truck, assuming that it's clean. But certainly going through and sanitizing as part of your pre-op operation would be really, part of your pre-op would be important. And then frequently sanitizing high touch surfaces during service. Contact, how can we reduce contact? We're seeing that through app-based ordering and payment, partial plexiglass guard, in this case over the pass-through window. I like the idea of using hooks or a touchless cubby system for handoffs. I know that cubbies have been generally something that's very new to food trucks. We've seen cubbies in the Whole Foods market. Amazon, I believe, provides cubbies where you can go and unlock it, access your food. Of course, there's the question of, well, don't I have to then clean the cubby if someone opened it, touched it? Yes, you would. So is there a touchless cubby option? I have seen tech companies propose touchless cubby solutions, so that may be something we're looking at in the future. And then lastly, it's just wearing PPE and making sure that people are distant. I do kind of look into the future and see that if dining areas have to be spaced out and render restaurants not profitable because they can't accommodate enough people at tables, food trucks do have a certain appeal, especially in counties that allow for public right-of-way space. In other words, this public right-of-way space could be substituted for the dining area that restaurants would be paying retail square foot prices at. So if that's the case, I mean, there may be relationships with cities that industry can forge where, open spaces, parks, things like that may become more accessible to food service operations. Because I know that, beyond just an interest in having commerce, we do want to see restaurants succeed. And so that may be an opportunity, and food trucks and other cart technologies could provide that. Okay, so that's that for that section. The exemption section is probably the driest one. So I'm going to answer some questions here. Let's see. So this comes from Mark. For design phase in our jurisdiction, we require self-closing windows for the pass-through. Yes, which by default requires an AC unit. Is this a norm or going above norms? Self-closing windows and screened pass-throughs are certainly the norm that I've seen across the country. I've looked at somewhere around 60, 70 different county requirements, so across most states in the United States, and I'd say that that's pretty consistent. What I meant by the plexiglass there was that would be once a window opens or slides open, there might be plexiglass sort of mounted with a sort of recess in front of it, so you could drop the order down, place it on a hook, for example, for customer pickup. But is this a norm or going above the norms? Self-closing windows are something I've seen quite commonly. As for the AC unit, Charlie and I, if you watch our episodes on Great Food Truck Race, we went to some of the hottest places in California, like Palm Springs. And I'll tell you that no AC was going to reduce the temperature of those food trucks. It was very hot. So it's very, there are people in Las Vegas, they'll have their AC on and, can that bring the temperature down? I imagine it cannot, but it does a little something. And I think as long as the refrigerators are cold and prep time is limited, that's, I suppose, the most optimistic we can be about relying on an AC unit. Hope that answers your question. Okay, so more of a comment. I think the issue with FDA developing more guidelines for mobile units specifically is due to differences in involvement in the local agencies. For example, many states do not have the authority to regulate fire control, mechanical, et cetera, like you would a brick and mortar. This is definitely a gap. I agree. I mean, there are a lot of, one could argue the division between USDA and FDA is problematic. And certainly the division between departments at the local level to complicate things further. So I think it's a good comment. Thank you, Lauren. All right, another comment here. In terms of clean or easily cleanable, our jurisdiction does not allow diamond plating. What are pros and cons of diamond plating? Well, it's a really common and affordable material, and it's easy to work with. So you can apply it and take it off and modify it easily. At least, if you're working with a truck upfitter or fabricator, that would be a solution that's readily available and affordable. I've used flooring that is much more expensive and slip proof and so on, but a lot of food truck businesses, entrepreneurial businesses, may not be able to afford that flooring. There's other flooring like vinyl, and I've seen there are quite a lot of counties actually provide an exhaustive list of the sources for flooring that they would approve. We could address that in greater detail later. But diamond plating, generally, Charlie, I mean, we flipped around on diamond plating quite a bit in operation that involves grease. So I would say that would certainly be a con, pro being its availability. Next question is, I can see the importance of the different flows, especially now with COVID distance between employees and maybe having extra hand washing sink at both ends of the truck. I agree, but that's going to put a real weight on the truck's use or storage of potable water. I agree. I mean, hand washing is very important. I think the most important thing though is really the distancing. Is that what does the handoff look like? Do you drop it on a hook? Do you put it in a touchless cubby? How do we make that handoff so it's not direct, it's more indirect? But I mean, I would love more hand washing sinks, the better, in every kind of facility. I'm a huge fan of it. Okay, last question here is disposable gloves, hand sanitizers in lieu of hand washing. Is this acceptable? Bring that up with Don Schaffner. He has a strong opinion of it, and I really appreciated listening to it. He's been really enthusiastic about the effectiveness of hand sanitizer on hands that are free of filth. So if you don't have filth on your hands, sanitizer I suppose, according to him, from what I remember, is that there was some data demonstrating that hand sanitizer can be effective. That flew in the face of my understanding, because I was always, no, you have to wipe away the debris, you have to wipe away the films, sanitizer can't penetrate. But like I said, that's a Don Schaffner question, and I have a lot of respect for him. So thanks for asking. And then do most jurisdictions require that a commissary or service station be licensed and inspected for use by food service vehicles? I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's going to kind of walk into my next section here, and we're running out of time, so I'm gonna jump on that. Okay, so the commissary, like I said, is preparing food and loading food. We have to be. That's my best work at making this icon look like catfish. But these are products that are regulated by USDA, and they do have retail exemptions, one for meat, one for poultry. There's another one for eggs and still forms. But that's something that you should be aware of if you, in fact, do come across a restaurant that's behaving as a commissary. There are some circumstances, some conditions that they'll have to meet, especially if they're selling to hotels, restaurants, or similar institutions. There's a call out there for 75% in terms of dollar value of total sales. I'll let you guys read that since we're kind of running out of time, but I will provide you with a link to that, and it'll sort of refer you back to retail exemptions, adjusted dollar limitations. So if people are selling to hotels, restaurants, or similar institutions, like, for example, a Starbucks in a mall, they would have to consider their percentage of sales there. If you're looking for guidance on from FSIS on whether or not the handoff from a commissary to a food truck, and then a food truck to a consumer, if that two jumps there mean that the commissary is subject to USDA FSIS inspection, I refer you to this 2018 guidance. I spoke with Peter Duryea there, policy expert, USDA, and he considered food trucks as being kind of like farmers market based, that the retail store exemption would still apply. But I do recommend that you refer back to this guidance. It's a little, I mean, you wouldn't think this guidance, because here, as you can see, it's discussing livestock slaughter. So you wouldn't think it'd be applicable, but this is where, this was the most recent update that they were able to make to accommodate these sort of online sales questions. As for FDA, retail food establishments are defined as essentially selling more direct to consumer than anybody else. It's a little different than the USDA retail exemption, where they talk more about, 75% of sales, the rest can, go to hotels, restaurants, and similar institutions. FDA doesn't have that kind of language in their exemption. So just be aware that if commissaries do start selling more to or less to direct to consumer than they do to other businesses and not to register. Yeah, and also, you know, one could argue that if they're handing it off to a food truck, that could be problematic. As you can see here in the 7th edition of the Q&A for FDA facility registration, B31, they say, are central kitchens that prepare food or for a chain of restaurants considered to be restaurants and therefore exempt from registration? And in this case, they do say that they wouldn't consider central kitchens exempt from registration. So something to be aware of when you begin to consider who ought to be regulating these commissaries. So that hopefully, Mary, has addressed your question. If I misread your question, I can answer it later. But that's pretty much it. And I know we're out of time. I just want you to know I did keep track of all the resources we referenced in our presentation, so you'll have access to those through the APDO website. Are there any questions? We just finished under the
I don't
right
know.
at 12:01. So.
I don't know if we can actually see people raising their hands.
Yeah. Okay, I see some more questions here. Whiskers. Yes, thank you. Yeah, my catfish. It took me 2 seconds, so I thought that was efficient use of time. Thanks, Adam. Okay, Adam again. No specialized processing for HRI. Also, in the past, FSIS said that third party would require FSIS or state NPI inspection if the payment was handled by the third party. Have you seen a change to that policy? Let me see here if I understand this right. No specialized processing for HRI. Oh, I see. I think are you referring to specialized processing in the FDA food code? So like sous vide, cook chill, those kinds of things? Generally, I will say generally, I have seen that states would not accept any kind of specialized processing for food that was intended for the food truck. I may be wrong on that, but like, for example, California, I don't believe that an ROP HACCP plan could include in its scope a food truck. So not optimistic about that. And also from a food safety perspective, I think it's pretty risky to put food on a food truck, especially if you're going to places like Florida in the summertime or the desert like Palm Springs. You know, having reduced oxygen packaging product in a refrigerator in a food truck and somewhere very hot, you know, risks the growth of Clostridium botulinum toxins and listeria. So as far as FSIS though, outside of specialized processing, like I said, their communication to me through Pete Duryea was that they recognized that food trucks were an extension of the restaurant, and so would be considered as an extension of the retail store, which would be where this retail store exemption may be applicable. So I hope that answers your question. Next is Matthew. It's far more complicated than 75% of sales in the USDA code. There are other sections and requirements. For example, using cooked chicken for retail stores is illegal in a food truck. Yes, so I wanted, as you can see, I'm just kind of running out of time there, but there's much more language written into the USDA retail store exemption, and all of it needs to be considered. There are definitely operations that are not listed in the retail store exemption that may be practiced by a commissary, in which case that would compromise their exemption status. So thanks for calling that out, Matthew. I hope I didn't. My intention was not to simplify what it means to be exempt. I just wanted to call out sales as an example, as that is something that that is becoming more and more diversified as we see the channels for sales increase through like mobile service providers, excuse me, meal delivery service platforms, so on. So thanks for bringing that up, Matthew. Great. Oh, geez, I just scrolled down. Okay, Caitlin, how do you find ghost kitchens? Are most forthcoming to regulatory authorities, or do they operate until they are discovered? Yeah, unfortunately, so generally ghost kitchens put a lot of energy into marketing because, well, they're hard to find and they want to work with businesses that are established. So generally online would be the best way to find it. Just, you know, especially if you're using Google, you can simply search by geography. And, but that, yeah, unfortunately that's going to be a difficult one to find. I personally find the service stations and food truck parks. that are available in Texas to be very hard to find as well. So you'll just have to, as a consultant, I can tell you that we always encourage them to be forthcoming, but unfortunately, you will have to do a little digging. Next is Adam. FSIS is a little broader definition of specialized.
I was just going to add that a lot of those businesses that do those services are B2B. They're business to business, and so they often don't have a website or a public-facing platform. So that can add to the real difficulty in locating those businesses. And some of them, while they may have good intentions, don't register or don't get on the radar and think that they will eventually or something like that. And so that's a real challenge for regulators.
Yeah, and but if you look at like Kitchen United and a lot of other ghost kitchens that are raised millions of dollars, they're not hiding. They're putting themselves out there and they're pursuing inspection. But those are kinds of businesses. In some cases you see $100 million company not really know what the requirements are, and it's kind of breathtaking, but it does happen. So Adam, FSIS has a little broader definition of specialized for HRI exemption. All right, maybe, I almost want to maybe break that out and make an entirely separate presentation. Maybe we'll tackle that in another presentation where we can address the full extent of the FSIS retail store exemption, because we're getting a lot of questions on it. So this retail, this is from Matthew. So the retail store is a separate exemption from the restaurant catering. Yes, that's correct. It is. The retail store exemption is a separate exemption. It's, if I'm, at least for meat, I believe it's 303(1)(d)(2) Roman numeral one. No, I don't know. I wrote it down on my presentation. Let's see. There it is. So 303(1)(d)(1) Roman numeral 1 through Roman numeral 3 would be the retail store. I believe the restaurants is Roman numeral 4, and then there's a central preparation facility. I think that's after that. So, but yeah, and then there are others available. So I recommend that maybe we have a separate presentation to tackle those, the complexity of those exemptions, or we just have someone from USDA come on and explain it. All right. So next is Mary. Are the food truck operators required to have HACCP plans and/or certified in sanitation training? They're generally required to have food handler training and a food safety manager on board. Some cities require that they have a vendor permit or solicitor's permit. But as far as having a HACCP plan, I've seen that in some states, but not all, very, very few. So like, for example, Maryland requires HACCP plans, but California does not. So that would be an example. Can HACCP offer some value? Absolutely. And I think we could have probably an entirely different presentation based on how HACCP plans might be customized to food truck businesses.
I'll just add to that, Michael. I'll just add to that, it's really too bad that the AFTO conference was postponed. But one of the pre-workshops was on active managerial control, and I think that actually the people leading that course, that would have been a great place to address food trucks and how HACCP from a retail point of view could work for them.
Yeah, and actually, 2 years ago, Charlie and I did a workshop on developing HACCP plans for AFTO in Burlington, Vermont, and love to do it again. Okay, so thank you, Adam. I saw your compliment. Very kind. And Mary, another question from you. Jurisdiction can require a truck operator to provide a written document from a base of operations that can be checked out. That's right. And I've seen that in a lot of counties where they'll require there be a log that documents visits to the base of operations and what has happened there. I think that's a great idea and a great resource for regulators to be able to learn what it is that the food truck is doing, and they can also compare it to the records there at the base of operations, I suppose. But yeah, great call out. Everybody, thanks so much for your time. Very helpful. Please continue. Oh, great. Thank you, Lauren. Well, so thank you so much, everybody, for all your questions and your level of engagement. It's been great. And Charlie, thank you for working with me on this presentation. I know I had a really great time. And if there are any other questions you'd like to address to us, you can reach out directly to our emails, Michael at Food Safety Guides or Charlie at foodsafetyguides.com, or just through AFTO. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Michael and Charlie, both. We really appreciate your time on this Monday. And again, the recording of this will be available in about 24 to 48 hours. So if you have other questions or you want to check out the recording and will be a copy of the slides as well on the AFTO professional development page. So with that, thank you again, Charlie and Michael. I hope everyone has a great day, and we look forward to seeing you or hearing you on our next professional development series episode. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.